Welcome to Joe Casabona this morning on the Brand New Business Podcast. Thank you so much, Joe, for coming on the show.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Joe is a podcast producer and coach who is literally helping me to grow my podcasting business to like millions of pounds. That's what I want, Joe, just millions of pounds. But,
All
tell
right.
everybody who you are. What do you do?
I am a podcast producer and coach, as you said. I basically help podcasters make their first $10,000 with their podcast, either through direct sponsorship or selling their own products and building their authority. I've been podcasting for 10 years. I have been teaching for 15. But my background is actually in web development, which I've been doing for over 20 years. So my internet savvy and my ability to monetize my own podcasts, I think, has led me down this path of helping other podcasters make money and turn their podcast into a business, or at least an income stream.
If you have a business, what is that business? Is it podcasting or is it web development or?
It is podcasting about 95% right now. So I'm not doing any client web development work, but I do make courses for LinkedIn Learning that are web development based courses. So I have two more of those on the docket. And once I finish those, which should be in December, I will only be doing podcasting and podcasting related stuff. So that's like my online course, my courses for podcasting, my coaching, and my production side. And then the money that my podcasts actually make.
Which is amazing, isn't it? Because you have completely pivoted. I mean, you're quite a famous web developer. Can you call a web developer famous? But I mean, you've written books. I mean, you're quite well known, aren't you, in the WordPress space?
Yeah, and that actually is, I can attribute a good amount of my podcasting success to that because I started a podcast in the WordPress space. And because I was well known through my books and speaking events and educational material, other WordPress companies wanted to sponsor my show. And so when I did this pivot, it was a little bit scary. Like, am I alienating the
Mm.
audience or the niche that got me to where I am? But luckily the pivot I think was well timed. Like, it's happening kind of as podcasting is growing and the creator economy is a thing. And a lot of WordPress based companies want to leverage the creator economy. So I'm like pivoting, but WordPress is coming with me a little bit, which is really nice.
And you are a rare breed, aren't you, of web developer? I said this to you last week. So as a designer, as a web designer, I have worked with lots of developers in my time, and they're a shy bunch. These guys are not up for the limelight. They're the backroom guys. They're the ones who stick their headphones on and work in a dark room and do the thing that they do best. So what happened to you, Joe? I mean,
Yeah, it's really interesting. Because that was, I mean, I've observed that, right, in my professional career and even in grad school. I was one of the more personal students or personable students in grad school. I'm really extroverted, and I'm going to attribute a lot of this to my second grade teacher, Miss McCullough, who is now Sister Mary. She became a nun, and I went to Catholic school like my whole life. She noticed how outgoing and I guess imaginative I was, and she encouraged me to join drama club. And so from second grade through high school, I participated in school plays and musicals, even though I'm a terrible singer. And that that really solidified my love for the limelight. I love telling stories, I love performing, but somewhere in high school, my church asked me to build them a website and I didn't know how, and they said they'd pay me and I was like, "Yeah, I'll figure it out. I'm 15. I've got all the time in the world."
yeah.
And what I loved about building websites was it allowed me to like flex the creative and logical sides of my brain. And so I think drama club plus like the creativity and sciency part of web development is what brought me down this path. I'm very outgoing, but I'm not the best programmer, but I'm very happy to not be the best programmer if it means I have these people skills.
And the
Yeah.
fame.
Yes, yes. I love teaching, right? Like I've been doing client work since 15. That's more than half of my life at this point, but like kind of a lot more. Um,
How
and
old are you? You've got
I'm
such a baby face.
Oh, thank you. I am 37 years old. So I'm not, I guess not a lot more, but more than half of my life. And something I routinely noticed, especially because I started doing web development in 2000, right? So like managing websites was a whole different breed back then. WordPress didn't come around until late 2003. So like people managing their own websites was so new and different and not like what it is today with like Squarespace and Wix. And so I would sit down with clients to teach them how to update their own website and they would all say, "I'm really sorry. I'm so bad at this. I'm really bad with computers." And I would always say, well, if everybody was good at what I did, I wouldn't have a job, right? Like I wouldn't. So I really loved the teaching part of it as well, kind of showing people my skill, but also having that empathy to be like, hey, yes, I've spent years doing this, so it's very easy to me and I understand that, but we're going to get you to a place where you can at least update the copy on your website.
Yeah, same for me in a way. So I am a designer. I've always been a graphic designer. So I've been a graphic designer for 25 years. It's practically your whole life. And but the thing that I love to do now is to teach people about branding, about how to use it and that kind of thing. But so how long have you been working for yourself?
That's contiguously 7 years at this point. I think 6 years. We're going on seven. But I freelanced all through high school and college and grad school. And then right after grad school, I worked for myself for about a year and a half until I couldn't be on my parents' health insurance anymore. And then I got a job at my alma mater, the University of Scranton. I worked there for about 3 years, basically until I realized that I was the only person that people would come to for questions. Like, I don't know if that sounds conceited or whatever, but like, I definitely didn't want to be the smartest person in the programming department at 26 years old or 27 years old. So I left. I went to an agency and I worked there for 3 years until our my wife and I, we have three children. So our daughter Teresa was born in 2017, and I realized that agency life was not compatible with family life. With the full support of my wife and 3 month old daughter, I left the agency life to go back into full time self employment.
And for you, was it it probably wasn't a daunting kind of feeling, was it? I mean, you had at that point dabbled, you'd been in and out, you'd done it before. So for you, it wasn't this big, heart-wrenching, soul-searching. It was very much like, I know I can make it work, so that's what I'm gonna do.
Yeah, it was maybe a little bit too much hubris when I went out on my own because, like, this was like the stakes were real, right? Like, I had a family and a mortgage and a thing, and my wife, who works, was on maternity leave. And even though she works at a hospital, right? I'm sure, like, I don't think this is political, this is just fact. United States doesn't have the best maternity policies. And so she had to use all of her sick time and vacation. So by the time I went out on my own, she was on unpaid maternity leave. And so I was the breadwinner for about, or the sole, I'm sorry, the sole source of income for about 2 months after that. And so that was scary, but I always kind of knew I would end up in self employment because I was like the kid who would have like a yard sale and try to sell all my toys at a profit. In high school, I made mix CDs at $5 a pop and like guaranteed them in 2 days, like some kind of weird, like realistic Zach Morris, like less handsome. Just kind of these schemes to make money. And so I always knew I was on this self-employment path. So it definitely, the prospect of going out on my own wasn't scary. The idea that, oh, I actually have to support people besides myself now, that was a little scary.
And that is a big thing. So, I mean, the whole purpose of this podcast is to give people that inspiration, really, to say, you feel like you can't, but maybe you can. And that's exactly what you did. Even with that whole pressure of the newborn,
Yeah.
the no income coming into the household, for you it was a case of like, well, now is the right time, now is the only time, so That's it. I'm going to do it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We have 3 kids now, and there was a 3-year gap between our first and our second, and then like a 9-month gap between our second and our third.
Wow.
They're like 15, like total 15 months. But we always talked about like, are we ready? Are we ready to have another one? Are we ready to, like, before Louis was born, our second? Are we ready? And then we're like, everybody asks this, but like, you're never really ready. No one ever says they're ready, right? And it's kind of the same with running a business. If you're going to do it, there's not going to be a perfect time, or there's never going to be a time that feels like the perfect time, right? You could always do more. You could always save a little more. But the things that I think helped me were I had a really good network of people. I was already building in public, so people knew what I was doing. And I did have a couple of streams of income, right? I didn't have one big client that if they left me like 2 weeks after I went out on my own, I'd be out of luck.
Mm.
And I did have about 6 months runway, right? And so I told my wife, I was like, if we get down to like 2 months runway and I'm not making any money, I will find another job. But I mean, we're almost 7 years on, and so far so good. So I guess we're like closer to 6, right? Because it coincides with my daughter's birthday. Um,
Yeah, you got to remember
so
that.
yeah, a lot of people listening are probably in a position that I wasn't when I first came out of college, right? The best advice I didn't take when I was in college was a family friend said, look, I know you want to start your own company. I know you want to work for yourself for your whole life, but out of college, get a job at a company and learn how they do things, learn their processes, meet people, build your network. And
Mm.
I, again, 21 and full of hubris, was like, I don't need to do that. I've been freelancing for like my whole life, basically. And then at 24 or 25, I was like, oh man, I should have listened to Eligio. I'm a New York Italian, so of course we have a friend named Eligio. Uh, and as soon as I got that job at the University of Scranton, I realized like the terrible mistake I made, right? Not getting a job, because I learned the proper way to do things, and I learned from my peers of areas outside of my expertise that it's really hard, where at least it was in say 2010, 2011, to learn on your own as a freelancer,
Yeah,
right? Like, you don't
yeah.
know what you don't know.
Completely agree.
Yeah.
So when I left college, I did 2 college courses. So I did a national diploma in graphic design, and I did a higher national diploma in graphic design. And then I got my first job as a junior graphic designer, and I was shit. I was so bad. I
Yeah.
guess I was good enough to get the job. My portfolio was good enough to get the job. But then I sat down and I was like, well, now you have to design stuff. And I thought, yeah, I can do this. And I did it. And then I had the mentorship then for people to come over and say to me, okay, Trudy, so what if you do this? And what if you do this and make that like that? And try this and try that. And I'll be like, oh,
Yeah.
wow, what did you just do? And that's where I learned the most from
Yeah.
from Pete. Thanks,
Yeah.
Pete.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. Shout out to my old boss, Cindy, at the University of Scranton. And then when I went to Crowd Favorite, Jeff Zinn was the guy who took me under his wing. And when he left, I was really bummed. I was like, what am I gonna do without you? He's like, you're fine. You're really good at what you do. And I'm like, because of you, though.
Yeah.
I think he would say I'm giving him too much credit, but he, at the very least, even if I had the skill, gave me the confidence to like work on projects for Disney, because that was like just seemed insurmountably hard to me.
And it's all a journey. And this is the thing that I'm coming across time and time again when I'm interviewing guests is about, so when is the right time? When is the right time to start your own business? And the guy who I interviewed last, James McGinty, he was, what did he say? Was he 62? He was 62 when he
Wow.
started his own business. And, his biggest regret is that he hadn't done it years before. But, it wasn't the right time because, and now he's loving life and he's past the age of retirement. So in the UK, it's 65. I think it is still, keeps
Mm.
moving. But so and now he's 67 and he's got no intention of stopping, because finally in his working career, he's doing what he loves. He's the master of his own destiny. And
Yeah,
yeah, he just wishes he'd done it before.
it's really easy to make excuses is too harsh, right? Because when you're in it, you feel like you're making the best decision,
Yeah,
even if
based
it's
on.
not the one you want to make, right? Like maybe if I was gainfully employed by somebody else right now, I'd be like, I can't start a business. I have 3 small children. Like childcare in the United States is so expensive. And we are sending our daughter to Catholic school because we want her to learn like the same sacraments that we learned at the very least. You know, I want to teach her how to be a Catholic, and then I want to teach her how to question everything about being a Catholic, right? That's like how I got to where I am. That's really expensive. And I'm like, I don't know if I could make ends meet. The fact that I did it when we had a 3-month-old and the ends were closer together, so it was easier to make them meet, we'll say, um, was really a gift. But I think if you have the drive and the work ethic, and the network, I really can't or understate how important my network was for me. Then make a plan, put some money in savings, and do it. You know, again, it's really easy for people to say that, just do it. But you're gonna have, if you want to, you're gonna have to at some point.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you sort of said to me when we were talking about what can we talk about, you said podcasting is what saved my business when I first went out on my own. Tell me a bit more about that.
I used to say it was luck, but it was, I planted a lot of seeds, right? And if you plant a lot of seeds, eventually you'll see a return and you'll see that growth. I'm not a good gardener or farmer at all, so I really botched that that analogy. But you know, you'll see if you plant a lot of seeds, you'll eventually see the fruit of your labor. There we go. Um,
Hey.
and so I had started the podcast in officially July 2016. So this was about a year before I went out on my own. And that podcast originally was to help me promote my online courses that I was just launching. They were WordPress based online courses, which I did because we were moving away from the University of Scranton, where I was teaching in an adjunct capacity, even after I left the IT department. And so I
And
couldn't, yeah. So like at the U, I went from student to grad student to adjunct professor and web developer in the IT department, back down to only adjunct professor, if that makes sense. When we moved away, because my wife got a job at a hospital about an hour and a half away from Scranton, I wanted to keep teaching. And so I made my own online courses. And I thought, well, a podcast seems like a good way to promote my online courses. And so I started the podcast. And then from day one, the podcast was sponsored. Like some guy reached out to me and was like, hey, can I have a backlink on your website? And I was like, no, but I'm launching a podcast if you want to pay me $99 to sponsor the first episode. And he's like, sure. And I really couldn't believe that happened. And then it
yeah.
happened again. And so I had these like little sponsors here and there. And when I went out on my own, I was panicking a little bit because I didn't have the client work I lined up. And I learned the hard lesson that like side hustle money is not full-time gig money. Almost miraculously, a hosting company in the WordPress space reached out and they wanted to support my work. And I say miraculously, but it wasn't. I was going to events and meeting people and telling people what I did. And they reached out and they said, hey, we want to sponsor your podcast for like 6 months. And I said, okay, that'll be $10,000. And they're like, okay. I think it was like $9,000. Like when it was all said and done, I gave them a long-term discount, but like, thanks for making me not find a sponsor for 6 months discount sort of thing. And so we'll say $9,000.
If anybody out there wants to sponsor my podcast for $10,000, you're welcome.
Yeah,
Bring
absolutely. She
it.
Trudy just said she's been a graphic designer for 25 years. Like she's got the clout and she's teaching people how to start their own businesses.
Yeah.
Surely if you help people start their own business, this is a great fit for that podcast, for sponsoring this podcast.
Okay, that's what I'm
Th-
thinking.
Yeah,
Banks.
so
Anybody who
exactly.
supports new startups could work.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. Make that an audiogram and just put it out there. I'll share it. So they reached out and they gave me a bunch of money to basically get me through the end of the year. And I was able to actually line up client work, right? Because I was still doing web design at that point, and develop a course or two. And then eventually I landed the LinkedIn Learning deal. So like that gave me the runway to actually build my business in a way I hadn't planned. And then it also gave me the confidence to reach out to other companies to be like, hey, this company just sponsored my podcast for 6 months. I have another spot here if you want it. It's growing quickly and podcast or WordPress developers love it. Are you trying to reach WordPress developers? And they're like, yeah, totally. So my podcast has been like 85% fully booked for the
And
last few years.
this is the How I Built It podcast.
Yes. Oh, yes. Trudy, I got to tell you, you made my day last week when you told me like you only knew me from the podcast work, because that's what I've been working for like 6 months. But yeah. So yeah, my podcasting podcast is called Make Money Podcasting, and that launched this year as we record this, 2022. But yeah, How I Built It, I launched in July 2016, and that's the one that accounts for most of my podcast income. I have another smaller like WordPress, like niche WordPress podcast that I launched during the pandemic when like all the WordPress events got canceled. And I said, I reached out to all the people who sponsor those events because now they had a bunch like a budget surplus for marketing. And I said, hey, since WordCamps are canceled, do you want to sponsor my new project called WP Review? It's going to be a podcast and video series. And they're like, yeah, we have money now. And so that's been sponsored from day one for the first 2 years. But yeah, I don't know how I built it is the one that has been the main driver of my podcast income for
your biggest
a long time.
earner.
Yeah.
So basically you have 3 podcasts out at the moment, and the one I know you for is the one that is that the least famous one or the least well-known one? But
it's the newest one, so
newest.
probably, but it's also the one I'm putting the most effort into. That was sponsored when it launched. And I basically told the sponsor, hey, I don't, thank you for your support for the first 12 episodes. I don't think this is a good fit for you. I don't think, and they agreed, right? But like, I'm glad I'm the one who brought it up instead of like asking them if they wanted to sponsor again, because I said, I think there's a disconnect between my target audience and who you're trying to target. And so now it's sponsored by Podcast Liftoff, which is my own thing. And I'm using it as a way to build my authority in the podcast space. And so I'm pretty confident. I never rule anything out, like if Buzzsprout comes to me tomorrow and is like, hey, we want to give you a bunch of money to sponsor Make Money Podcasting, I'll absolutely consider it. But I'm pretty confident at this point that show will remain unsponsored, and it'll be a way for me to build my list and get people into the Podcast Liftoff Playbook and things like that.
And that's the thing, isn't it, with podcasting? Because I think one of the questions I've asked you in the past is that, because you said that you shouldn't just start a podcast without any kind of end game. What's the point? What is the point of it? What do you want it to achieve? And if it's going to make money, how's it going to make money? And that can be direct or indirect. Indirectly being, you enhance your image, you enhance your brand, you enhance your credibility, show your knowledge and that kind of thing. So there's that side of it, as well as the direct sort of sponsorships.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And a lot of podcast pontificators will say, sorry, I just like stole Evo Terra's, I think that's the name of his podcast, but this is not like a jab at him or anything like that. But a lot of people who comment on podcasting will say, podcast pundits will say, just launch your show, don't worry about making money at first. And I think that is the absolute wrong approach. Don't look at the bottom line at first, but I think, how is my podcast going to make money is the second question you ask yourself, where the first one is, what's my podcast's mission?
Yeah.
Who do I help and how do I help them? And then number 2 is, how is this show eventually going to make money? And I have like a little bit of a framework for this. It's called the SMASH framework for figuring out how your podcast can make money, where like the S is sponsorship. That's the most obvious one. Then there's membership, affiliates, selling, as in selling your own products, or helping people through coaches, consulting, and coaching, consulting, and courses. And so if you have that in mind, you can steer the content. You have your mission statement, you can steer the content, and then your call to action is a lot clearer too, right? I don't
Mm.
promote my own services very much on how I built it because there's usually already 3 sponsors. I'm very lucky that most of the time like I think the metric is like 67 to 70% of available podcast ad space is usually booked up, right? So if a podcast has 100 spots for the year, at most they'll have 70 of those spots filled up, and then 30 they usually use to promote their own stuff. I'm higher than that average for whatever reason. People like me, I maybe, and so I'm usually around 85% full. And so I don't really promote my own stuff that much because I don't want 4 calls to action
No.
or 4 promo spots for a 40-minute episode or a 45-minute episode. But that's also kind of why I made Make Money Podcasting. So I will point people to Make Money Podcasting from how I built it. And on Make Money Podcasting, that's where I promote my upcoming webinars or my mailing list or my big sale on the Podcast Playbook, whatever it is. The missions for those 2 shows are very different and they make money in different ways.
Yeah, interesting, interesting. I think so podcasting is a great way to create or raise your own personal brand. That's a really important thing. How do you feel about this kind of pressure that's in the podcasting space at the moment? Was it always there, or is it becoming a more kind of crammed sphere now? Is it starting to take off in such a way that there's not going to be so much room for everybody? What do you reckon?
It definitely feels like that, but if we look at, say, statistics from Edison Research, right, they look deeply at podcast listening trends and statistics. It's pretty steady growth, right? So, Serial, the podcast Serial, is probably the thing that kicked off like the first big growth in podcasting, and that was like 2014. The show Lore by Aaron Mahnke happened around the same time, and so these 2 podcasts, along with a few others, but these are the ones that really stand out for me, are the ones that showed people, hey, podcasts don't just need to be like 2 white guys talking about Apple. Like that's podcasts can be more than that. And now as we move into 2022 or 2023, yes, podcasting is a lot more popular. The tools are a lot easier, right? Trudy, you use WordPress, right?
Yeah,
So you remember like the blog explosion from like probably 2004 to 2006, where
yeah,
it just seemed like everybody was getting a blog because WordPress made it really easy to start a blog.
yeah. There's been lots of, I guess, like faddy type.
Yeah, and in 2004, right? That was, at least in America, that was the first time that like blogs actually had an influence over the presidential election. So like you had like Huffington Post on one side and Hot Air on the other, and these blogs were like showing, like presenting information to people in a way that wasn't one of the top 3 media outlets in America.
I wonder how they do it now with TikTok.
Yeah, yeah,
At the
right. Maybe,
moment.
yeah. And like, I mean, the Biden administration, I think at the beginning of his administration, did meet with like TikTok influencers about, I think, a positive campaign about the vaccine. So I not 100% on that. If somebody wants to fact check me, feel free. But podcasting is in a very similar position, I think, over the last few years, where the tools and equipment have made it easier to start a podcast. And now you definitely need to create content that differentiates you.
Yeah,
Because like every podcast between like 2014 and pretty much every podcast between 2014 and say 2020 was like a true crime podcast or an interview podcast or a sports podcast. And now we're seeing, and obviously there were more than that, right? There were tech podcasts and spiritual podcasts, but it just felt that way. Now it needs to be more than just a bunch of dudes talking about something or a bunch of people talking about something. And that's one of the things that I like helping people with, right? Is don't just do an interview show. If you want to raise your authority in your space, you need to show people what you know and demonstrate that. And if you take one out of every four like episodes and just make that a shorter episode of you talking about something around branding, then people will get to know, like, and trust you. And then you'll be able to say, hey, by the way, I have this course on branding. And that's my ultimate goal with Make Money Podcasting, right? Is have interviews so people can get other perspectives, but always make sure the interviews are about you demonstrating a conversation and not just one-sided. Hey, like, tell me about you, tell me what you do, show me how you're an expert. I like to have more of a dialogue, right? And we've done that a little bit, right? Where you've talked about your background and how you were in graphic design. That's really the way that you demonstrate your authority through a podcast.
So I'm doing it right.
Yeah, I think
Well,
I think so.
partly
Yeah.
I did take on board what you told me actually about creating the mini pods,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
every so often I need to drop in one. And to be fair, through talking to all the guests who I've spoken to so far, there's so many little pullouts I could just like dive in and say, okay, so from episode one, we learned this about branding. And from episode two, we learned this about branding. And obviously, today, for me, this kind of personal branding thing, there's loads to be said on this subject alone
Yeah. Yeah.
about people finding the courage to be able to stick their head above the parapet and to be visual, to be seen and heard, and stick their head above the parapet and say, "Look at me," because for a lot of people, this is their worst nightmare.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, do you remember the trend from like the mid 2000s or mid to 2000s to like maybe mid 2010s is people, even freelancers, would use like the plural on their website. They'd be like, we
We
work with this, our work. And I'm like, who's our? I don't say we, I'm just me. And I don't want people reading my copy and thinking otherwise, because I don't want them coming in thinking I have a team of people and I'll be on call all the time.
Yeah,
So I always made it very clear, hey, it's just me. You get me from 9 to 5 on weekdays. And as a result, I'm not going to be as expensive as the agency. You'll have higher touch with me during that time, and I'm going to really learn and understand you. But if you need somebody on call 24/7, I'm not your guy.
yeah. And that is it. That is what branding does. It sets a realistic expectation. This is who I am, this is what I do, this is how I do it, this is why I do it. And
Yes.
that then becomes your ethos, what you live by. And that, exactly as you say, the authenticity of saying I and not we.
Yeah.
You're not trying to be something else. I mean, lots of people are. Lots of people come to me and say, oh, Trudy, I want to look bigger than I am. And lots of people say that. I want to give the perception of being bigger because they want to get bigger. That's for them,
Right.
that's the end goal. But for
Mm,
others, it is pointless because you are what you are. And if you pretend to be bigger, then people might expect more.
right. Yeah, that's exactly right. If you yeah, I want to be bigger to attract bigger clients, but like that's really a double-edged sword, right? Because the expectations are a lot higher.
Yeah.
When I was working at the agency, again, like we worked on a bunch of Disney projects. I'm a huge Disney fan.
Mm.
So like that was like my dream. But I was hanging out at, well, my wife then fiance, like I was at her house, her parents' house. And I got a call from my boss at 9 p.m. Like, hey, we need you. Like we need to launch this site by 4 a.m. And so I worked all night. Again, like I was younger and fine. Like it felt like kind of crappy, but really cool. Like working with a team to like in a good groove. But if you're a freelancer, how many times realistically can you do that before you get burnt out?
No,
And
exactly.
that's like the expectation you're setting when you want to try to appear bigger than you are. And that's like I've had clients call me when I was doing freelance only. Like I had clients call me at midnight and I immediately said, this is inappropriate. Do not call me anymore at this time. If you call me at
That's
this time,
interesting. I
yeah.
just would not have even answered that phone call.
Yeah, I was awake and I really wanted to, because she had done it a couple of times. I really wanted to communicate how inappropriate it was.
Not acceptable.
Yeah, and I said, if you call me after 6 p.m. Eastern time anymore, she was in New York City, so we were on the same time zone. I will be adding $100 surcharge every time you do it. And
Oh,
if you don't pay that surcharge, I'm taking down your website. She never called me again after that, after midnight or after 6 p.m.
being a freelance is a slightly double-edged sword sometimes, in that you can make yourself overly accessible, and you can accept or that you are sort of the puppet on somebody else's string. But it's up to you to set that boundary. It's up to you to say, no, okay, I decide. And ultimately, who are you going to work for? Is it acceptable to you that somebody could even call you at that time?
Right.
You might manage them out like like you did, and you say, okay, well, if you're going to call at that time, you're going to pay for it.
Right.
And I'm still not going to answer the phone, but you you
Yeah,
know
right. If I wake up because you are trying to contact me at this time, and yeah, it's you set that boundary. It should be at the I mean, I was younger then, so I didn't know to set this boundary. Because it was very like, who would do this? Oh, lots of people would do this actually, but that's something you define at the beginning of the relationship. And like I've had clients, like one brought me on and he was like, hey, we might have a late night or two like leading up to launch, and I said fine. And then after that I was like, this doesn't happen again. I was like, if you need somebody to work through the night, I'm not your guy anymore. But I think for a lot of freelancers especially, right? So like if you're listening to this and you're thinking, but like if I don't have any clients, where does my money come from? I'm just going to accept whoever wants to give me money, right? This is a trap that a lot of freelancers fall into. I'll say two things here. Like make sure that again you have runway so that you don't have to take anybody who like has a check at your door, because taking that $100 job could prevent you from taking that $10,000 job, right? Like
yeah.
that's the opportunity cost you got to think about. But then also diversify your income, right? I gave a talk at a WordCamp several years ago about feast and famine, and how like the ancient Egyptians had these silos, right? So that they would put in when they had feast, when they had more than they needed, they would store it for the upcoming famine. So you make sure you have that runway, but then you also diversify your income through having a podcast that maybe generates some money or brings in clients that your ideal clients, right? Because Trudy, as you said, it's about your message, it's about your branding. And if you have good branding, if your message is dialed in, the discovery calls or the sales calls are not really sales calls. The person who's calling you is already sold on you.
Yeah, that's
And
what good
so,
branding does.
exactly. And having a podcast can really help with that. Podcast, YouTube channel, like something where people see you and hear you and feel like they know you.
Yeah, because people do business with people essentially.
Yeah. And you mentioned when we spoke last week, right? That was the first time we ever spoke in real life, quote unquote, real life, aside from like, LinkedIn comments. And, you kind of knew my background a little bit. You knew I had children and you knew I was based in the United States, and like you knew a little bit about me, and that helped you trust me more. And so and likewise for you, like seeing you comment on my posts and seeing what you're posting, that's what led me to reach out to you to get on that kind of discovery call. I felt like I trusted you. Like I liked what you were putting out there and I liked the work that you were doing, and I wanted to learn a little bit more about you.
It was really interesting what you just said actually about opening up your revenue streams, and that meaning not diversifying what you do. Like, so you do one thing, you dig a hole that's an inch wide and a mile deep in one area, but there's more ways to show yourself. So whether that's going to be through your podcast, or whether you're on social media, whether you're doing courses, whether you're working one to one people or through memberships or whatever, but the core offering has to be the constant.
Yeah, it's like a tree, right? You see the big trunk, but underneath you see all the roots
Mm,
leading to the one big trunk, right? And so the big trunk is the thing that you specialize in, and the roots are how you get more income through that speciality, right? So like something that I like to tell people is I have a nice house. on a 1/4 acre land, right? So it's like not a lot of land. Our backyard is not huge by any means, but it's big enough for my kids to play in. I pay somebody to mow my lawn. I pay them $30 a week to mow my lawn.
Mhm.
And a lot of my friends are like, why don't you just do that yourself? Well, here's why I don't do it myself. Because sometimes on the weekends I get too busy and then I have to mow my lawn during the week. Because if I go 2 weeks in the Northeast, we get a lot of rain and a lot of sun over the summer, and you need to mow your lawn weekly. And if you go 2 weeks, I don't have a professional lawnmower, so it gets stuck a lot. And there was one time where I had gone 3 weeks and we got a lot of rain, and my crappy lawnmower and my
Wow.
crappy weed whacker didn't work. And it took me, I had to do it on a weekday because my wife was working the weekend and I had the children. And it took me 5 hours
Oh no.
from start to problems to finish to mow my lawn. 5 hours. My billable rate is $200. So that is $1,200 in
It
lost
costs
income.
to mow
So
your lawn. Oh god.
paying somebody $30 a week for the 4 or 5 months that my lawn needs to be mowed every week, easiest decision I've ever made.
Yeah.
And so when the people listening, when you're facing down this, well, I need to take this job because I need money, you could be spending 5, 6, 10 hours working for $30 an hour when that $100 or $150 an hour job is right down the road, but you can't take it because now you took this cheaper job. So putting all of these things in place now, having savings, having the roots of the diverse income in this speciality trunk that we're going to call it. I keep saying speciality because I love Obi-Wan Kenobi. So but it's like specialty, like the thing that your niche, right? These are all safeguards against being in that desperate place where you need to take the crappy freelance job just to pay the bills. Those are the things that you can start doing today so that you don't have that nightmare client who calls you at midnight.
Yeah, totally agree with everything you just said. So it's so important to decide. And quite often the thing I come across with people is that it's hard for them to. I love the fact that the Americans say niche and England we say niche.
Yeah, that's like a point of contention here in the United States too. People will tell me I'm very wrong for saying niche, but again, I've got like that hard New York accent, you
Yeah,
know?
you say niche, I say niche.
Yeah, yeah.
Fine. But, people struggle to condense it. The amount of times that I come across people and I say, "Tell me what you do," and they say, "Well, I do this, I do that, I do the other. I do it for this kind of person, I do it for that kind of person. I can help this person, this person, this person, this person." And I'm like, "No. Okay, to start with," and, I love to use an analogy of, lighting a fire. If you want to light a fire, do you grab the biggest log you can find and put a match to it? Because what's going to happen? You might get a smolder of smoke or something, or do you find the kindling? Do you find the little leaves, the dry ones, the easiest ones, and that's how you build a fire. That's you build up to the big log so that those little bits of kindling are your niche. That's kind of how you start. And you can grow, but to start with, if you really want to start a fire, you need to find that niche.
I love that. So I'm turning the tables really quick. What do you
Hmm.
tell people like when they have that, like I do everything? Like how do you brand that?
Well, often, a lot of times, because the people who I work with tend to be one man bands, so on solo entrepreneurs. And I dig into their experience. So, what did they know? How did they get to this point where they the service that they provide can give real value? And a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times, the person that they help the most is them 5 years ago.
I love that.
And so what is their experience, and they know that person inside out, back to front. They know how they feel, they know what problems that they have, they know exactly how to solve the problem that they're having. And that becomes your superpower then, because you know
Oh,
how
that's
to
so
talk to
good.
them, you know what to say, you know how they
Yeah.
feel, you know how they want to feel. So that then becomes a brand.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Because I'm struggling a little bit, right? I got a lot of my web design clients from word of mouth, and then like my book was a thing, and so people are like, "Oh yeah, you wrote the book, I'm gonna hire you." And now that I'm pivoting, I was like, "Oh yeah, like speakers, educators, authors, like I am those things." But I already have a successful podcast. Like me 5 years ago was more the successful podcaster than the speaker, coach, whatever. And I'm like, how do I find clients? And what you just said, like really helped me solidify in my head, like just I'm really glad I asked this question. I come on your show and then I get really great insight. Um
Yay.
because you're exactly right. You know the language that they use, right? And you know what they're struggling with, and then that's going to help write the copy or for podcasting define your podcast mission statement. And the great thing about that is that every year, right, you get to move up a year and you solve a new problem.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. There's just so much room for growth, and
Yeah.
that's and you know, you don't need to change. You can just add on. It's like adding more kindling, adding bigger
Yeah.
twigs, and to get to the point where you can put that big log on the fire.
That's super cool. Well, thanks for indulging me on that question. That's awesome.
Hey, we're all learning.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
It was last week when we were talking. You were questioning me about, you know, what how would I come across your podcast? What was I getting out of it? And then you were at the same time giving me so many hints and tips about how I could help, what I could do with mine and what I should be doing. I was like, oh gosh, writing all this down. So
Yeah, well, because that's the thing, right? I'm trying to figure out, right? You're like, you seem perfectly situated in my niche or my target audience, and so I wanted to hop on a 15 or maybe it was longer than that minute call where I learned more about your problems and where you're at and what you're struggling with, and I understand how valuable your time is, and so I I wanted to maybe give you some tidbit. I made it really clear that this is not a sales call, right? I'm not doing the hard sell at the end of the discovery. This is for me to help me. And down the line, if you find like, or whoever finds what I do valuable, then great. But you've helped me. And so I wanted to give you some advice as like a thank you for taking the time out of your day.
what was really interesting, what I think people can take a lot of value from here and now, though, as well, is what you did is perfect in terms of you take somebody who you think is your perfect client and you ask them, what are your problems? And so many people don't do that. They make assumptions, they think
Yeah.
they know, or, you know, you can learn so much and get so much information and so much help for you to be able to talk to your target market by just asking people. And we don't do enough of it. I don't do enough of it. But it's
No,
asking the right questions as well. But you weren't broad with a like a broad sweep. You specifically asked me, what are your problems?
absolutely. And then I wrote down a bunch of stuff you said, and I know the language that you used, right? Because that's the other thing. When you're entrenched in a thing, you maybe don't know the language that 5 years ago you, or for me again, it's not 5 years ago me, it's somebody else, and I want to learn the terms that they're using might be different from the jargon that I know. And so you're absolutely right, people don't do enough of this. I certainly don't or didn't. I was like really scared. I was really scared to niche down at first, right? Because again, it feels like you're closing off an
Yeah.
income stream, but you're not.
No.
You're closing off a trickle to turn on the fire hose. And then talking to your target audience, like what if they don't like you? What if they say something that like that scares you or dissuades you from doing this? Like I'm just going to sit in my own head. That's like an echo chamber where I feel like I'm doing the right thing, but you're not, or you're probably not. And so talking to your target audience builds your network, helps you help people, and helps you understand more about the problems they're solving, which is only going to make your niche offering better. And again, increase that pressure from the fire hose. Like this is advice I've gotten for years. I've been freelancing for 22 years. And I just started taking this advice this year because it finally like, or maybe like in the last year, because it finally caught up to me, right? I finally like ran out of well, my personal network is totally different from the niche I'm moving into now. It's like people know me for web development, and I made a lot of connections there, and I had people who were good at marketing, who were graphic designers, send me their clients, be like, hey, I'm doing a mock-up for somebody. Can you turn it into a WordPress site? Yeah, great. I never had to market. Now I do. And now I'm learning these hard-fought lessons that you, dear listener, who you're thinking about leaving your job, listen to these things.
Yeah.
You will be so much better off than me in 5 years if you do these things now.
Yeah, it's enormous. And ask people as you're going along as well, I would say, because for example, with courses, building courses, you build the course that you think people want, and actually it turns out that you've missed something, or you've just not quite phrased something right, or something's not quite on point, and it just goes over everybody's heads. And it doesn't mean it's a bad product. It just means that you're slightly off. And
Yeah.
by asking people the right questions, which is not easy to do, but by asking people the right questions, it can so help.
This was such a weird mental block for me, because when I taught in the classroom, that's exactly how I would teach, right? I would have a general outline for what I'd want to cover, but I wouldn't make every lesson of the semester before the semester started. I would have like maybe the next two ready. And I remember so vividly one time I taught this grad class, and it was like a PHP class. So it was a programming class or a database class. And one of the prerequisites was like HTML and CSS. And 80% of the students were written into that class because they had to take it before they graduated, which means they didn't have the prerequisites. And so on the first day, I'm like, all right, so this is what we're going to cover in the course. And I just saw blank looks. And I was like, well, you guys know how to program, right? And they're like, no, we got written out of that class. Well, you know HTML, right? No, we got written out of that class. You know CSS, right? We got written out of that class. So I was like, all right, great. So starting next week, we're going to learn HTML and CSS. And then the following week, we're going to learn how to program. And then we'll get to the stuff that I wanted to teach.
Wow.
But in making my own online courses, I was like, I'm just going to go in a hole for 6 months, develop what I think is the perfect course, and then no one buys it. And I've wasted time, and I haven't met an industry, solved a problem for my niche.
I've got that t-shirt. Been there.
So now I take, thanks to advice from smarter people than me, I take the same approach I took teaching in the classroom. I have a vague outline. I pre-sell the outline, and if people are interested, they buy it. And then I teach the first lesson, and based on questions and feedback, all right, now I know what I need to cover in lesson 2, or now I need to move things around. And after I do that cohort, right, that live thing with people giving me real feedback, now I have a course that I can actually sell, a self-paced course on Evergreen or whatever.
Yeah.
And I made money from the very start.
Boom. That's it, isn't it? That's absolutely
Yeah.
it. That's what it all comes down to. I mean, there's just been a stack of amazing tips and experiences that you've shared with us. So that's been incredible. But I know for a fact that you have got like a million, billion, trillion hints and tips and help that you can give to people in your courses and on your websites and your podcast. So how do people find you?
You can head over to podcastliftoff.com/logo lady, all one word. And there will be a special offer there for getting into my Podcast Liftoff Playbook at a discount. But then you can also join my mailing list. And for your audience, I'm going to offer free 15-minute coaching calls where we'll solve your biggest podcasting problem. So again, that's over at podcastliftoff.com/logo lady, all one word.
Whoa, guys, what are you waiting for? This guy's amazing. You seriously have helped me so much, like all through your free stuff. I mean, I haven't paid you anything. I want to, I will do at some point, but I just feel like, that you give so much like information, help. I've listened to all of your episodes in podcast, how to monetize your podcast.
Yeah.
So I'm still not making any money, but that was never the point. I just been soaking up all the information I can, and there's been so much that you give totally for free. So yeah, definitely go and check out Joe, check out his podcast, check out his website, check out the offer, because yeah, it's amazing. Thank you.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
I was so excited when you said you could come. Yeah.
Awesome.
So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day.